This is good.
Are you scrolling through social media?
Yeah.
Did you know that you're currently giving yourself an array of crippling conditions that are likely to ruin your entire life?
I don't know.
Social media started out as web forums during the early days of the internet. A fun concept, but overall not seeing very much use due to how limiting the technology back then was. It wasn't until the invention of the smartphone that social media took off into something extraordinary. Almost everyone has a smartphone, even most homeless, and you're practically required to have it on you at all times. This ease of access has transformed social media from being a handful of forums to becoming an integral part of everyday life. You might think that last part is an exaggeration, but I promise you it is not. iPhones have this feature where it tracks how much time you're spending on it every day and on what apps. We ended up hosting a survey to get some of the tracking data from the students here at Chafee. The responses ended up averaging out at about 9 hours of screen time a day, with a significant portion, about 7 hours, going towards social media apps. That ends up being a very large chunk of each day dedicated to scrolling on social media. At a glance, there isn't anything that seems too concerning with spending so much time on these apps. So what makes screen time the topic of so many scientific studies? We've all seen one or two of those infographics warning against looking at your phones too often, but we ignore them, because how could spending time on your phone be a serious problem? There are quite a few people online who publicly share the sentiment that spending so much time on social media isn't a negative thing. One user says, "If I'm not spending time on my phone, there's simply nothing else to do. What, am I meant to take on a hobby? Well, I'll just end up back on my phone to learn about that hobby anyways." Now, it is obviously a ridiculous claim that watching a tutorial on how to bake a cake is the same as spending 7 hours scrolling through Reddit, but a lot of people who try to justify the amount of time they spend on social media share a similar view. Here's another post where a user claims that people aren't addicted to their phone. If they were, they wouldn't be able to function, and that people who spend almost all their time on their phones are actually engaging with loved ones, learning about the world, and keeping up with their job. The second point here is obviously not true, as the most used apps in America are TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And while there certainly is a lot of beneficial content on those platforms, like informational videos, it's safe to say that the overwhelming majority really isn't.
Yeah. I will stay alone and run this town alone.
The first point this user makes is actually rather interesting, because it dismisses the claim that being on your phone all the time makes you an addict, because you still do other things. This may seem like a logical point if you take it at surface value. You don't see cities infested with zombies because of phones. But what defines addiction is not that you become a husk of a person. The actual definition of addiction is, and I quote, "a compulsive, chronic, physiological, or psychological need for habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects, and typically causing well-defined symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, or nausea upon withdrawal or abstinence." The reason that addiction of all kinds end up forming is because of dopamine, the chemical released when we experience something that gives us some form of satisfaction. This could be doing a ton of things. Doing well on an exam, hanging out with your friends, listening to music, and you guessed it, scrolling through your phone. All of these activities will end up sending the dopamine to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that manages doing tasks, as a way of saying, "Good job, you accomplished something, so now you can be happy." The output of dopamine ends up being quite a bit more excessive when you're mindlessly scrolling through your phone due to how easy it is and how long you can do it for. This means it could easily end up overloading the part of the brain that controls you doing things, warping your perception of reality permanently in the process. Many studies have linked screen time addiction to reduced volume in areas of the brain associated with impulse control and behavioral regulation, much like individuals with drug addictions. This particular study also goes on to say that the effects of screen time addiction are just as detrimental as that of opioid and cocaine addiction, citing how the way that the brain deforms itself in both cases is nearly identical. This isn't quite as big a problem for most adults, as the prefrontal cortex fully develops around the mid-20s. meaning that the onslaught of dopamine, while still distracting, isn't as detrimental in the long term. Being an actual serious addiction also means that while cutting yourself off from screens isn't going to be quite as detrimental as if you were doing the same with substances, it does have some serious withdrawal effects. This screen withdrawal is when the quick short bursts of dopamine people are used to receiving are suddenly gone, causing them to become desperate. The effects here can range from sudden depressive episodes to violent outbursts. And of course, like all withdrawal periods, you either have to tough it out through increasingly detrimental effects, or you relapse and the process starts all over again. But what exactly is it that social media is doing to cause such a massive influx of dopamine? Well, this can be traced back to the way that social media has been changing in relation to user autonomy. Videos auto-playing whatever you're hovering over, not letting you decide if you really even want to watch it before being forced to, pop-out features that keep videos playing even when you tell it to return to the home screen, to keep you hooked even as you look for something else. And of course, the TikTok approach, where you have no influence over what comes next. With YouTube autoplay, you at least have those few seconds to decide on whether or not you wanted to watch the next video online. On TikTok, you don't have a choice, and that format has become the favorite for a ton of different platforms. YouTube has Shorts, Instagram has Reels, Facebook has Reels, even Spotify has Reels. All of these companies have seen how successful it was on TikTok, and have started to implement it in at least some way. On top of that, psychologists have linked extended use of social media to depression, anxiety, loneliness, and low self-esteem. And surprisingly, that actually contributes a lot towards making it addictive. The more desperate and vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to turn to addiction. This means that you fall into the loop of feeling bad, wanting to feel better, turning to social media, and then feeling bad again. And when you're in that loop, it's very hard to recognize exactly what's going on. Now that we have established that people do indeed become addicted to social media, we need to cover the major ways that being on any kind of screen can affect your health. The first of these major issues is blue light. Blue light is the special kind of illumination that comes from the screen of your device. It has special properties other lights do not, such as shorter wavelengths and higher energy, allowing it to pass directly through the outermost layer of your eye, the cornea, meaning it can deal some real damage. Blue light alone can inflict you with some nasty conditions, like cataracts, which cloud up your vision, requiring surgery to remove. Macular degeneration, which creates black spots in vision, which is currently completely incurable. Inhibited melatonin secretion, which messes with hormone production, potentially leading to far worse quality sleep, impaired memory, and obesity. Dry eye, which sounds fairly harmless, but makes your eyes vulnerable to being infected, which can lead to you losing your vision entirely, and a ton more complications that you just generally want to avoid. The other major issue is a lesser-known condition called myopia. Myopia is typically a genetic disorder, but it can develop if you often spend long periods of time looking at something right in front of you, causing the eye to only effectively perceive things that are close, by deforming itself in a few different strange ways. This does not only happen with screens, but they have become a major contributor due to how they additionally strain the eye, making myopia even more likely to develop. Thankfully, there is a fairly simple way to negate the effects of both blue light and myopia. That being the 20-20-20 rule. Every 20 minutes, look at something 20 feet away for 20 seconds. This helps with the eye strain from blue light by giving your eyes a much needed break by looking at something that doesn't emanate artificial light. And it also helps your eyes readjust to looking at something that's far away, so they don't become accustomed to having to only visualize things that are a few inches from your face. And while the 20-20-20 rule is much better than unadulterated screen viewing, don't let this trick you into thinking it makes you immune. Your eyes will still take permanent damage over time with enough exposure. A lot of people are going to ignore the health complications of social media and screens in general because when you're addicted to something, you ignore information that is negative towards that addiction. This is known as confirmation bias. It's why people only listen to information that coincides with their pre-existing beliefs. And while it affects people all the time, the influence of addiction makes it a lot more potent. So, it's completely natural if you find yourself wanting to disagree with the information in this video. Just keep in mind that in studies where people significantly reduced their social media intake, the result was always them being happier and healthier. So, the next time you're mindlessly scrolling through your Instagram Reels or your TikTok feed, ask yourself if the funny fat man falling over compilation is really worth a lifetime of permanent impairment.